Good morning, everybody, or actually afternoon now. Welcome to this session of the community table. We're excited because of the topic today is boundaries, ethics, and confidentiality. This is a topic that we've not covered in a long time through the community table. And our presenters are Ryan Villigren and Khalil Martin from Housing First University, who've done a wonderful job for us in the past, the other two sessions. I have no doubt that this one's going to be just as good. Ryan and I were just talking that if you need a certificate or CEUs for today's session, Ryan will explain how to make that happen. And so I'm just going to turn things over to our more than able presenters here.
Thanks so much, Laura. Hello, everybody. I see some familiar names in the chat, and I know we have a bunch of new folks joining us today that we haven't met. So I want to do a very brief intro about who we are, where we're coming from, and our lens on this awesome kind of content that we're going to talk to you about today. So my name is Ryan Villigran. I use they and them pronouns. I'm a training specialist with a program called Housing First University. And that is the training and technical assistance program out of a nonprofit called Pathways to Housing PA. So Pathways is a homeless services organization who uses the housing first model and harm reduction practices in an effort to end chronic homelessness in the city of Philadelphia. So Pathways has been doing this work since 2008 and have had a ton of success over the years. Currently, we're housing nearly 600 folks in that scattered site model. So people who have experienced long-term homelessness get an apartment of their own without any preconditions or readiness requirements or sobriety or treatment requirements. And they've been so successful, around an 85 to 90% housing retention rate after after a 5-year period. And so Housing First University is our chance to kind of share out best practices that we've learned over the years with other communities and just to support the good work that you're doing. That's a little bit about me and about Housing First University. I would love to kick it over to my co-presenter to introduce himself.
Thanks, Ryan. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Khalil. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I live in the Philadelphia area. My background is actually mostly in like homelessness and substance use settings. In the past year, I've moved to kind of like strictly to the mental health space. I'm a therapist now, and I also teach at a university here in PA. But before this, my work was at Pathways with Ryan, doing some of this training work, and then also supporting a team that was doing the housing first work. And I always love that Ryan does such a great job at explaining like what Pathways is, so I can just be like, yeah, I did that. But that's my experience. That's what I'm coming to this space with, and I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Here's some quick housekeeping. We're just inviting folks to be present with us. It is a short session given the length of the content. Sometimes we'll take content like this and go all the way for like 3 straight hours. So an hour and a half will be pretty quick. And so I'm just inviting you to be present, ask questions as you have them, push back, offer critical insights. We love all that. We love engaging with that. Would rather do that than just talk at you for an hour and a half. We are offering CE credit for licensed social workers and licensed clinical social workers. If that's you, make sure you stay the whole time and participate in our discussions, and make sure you complete the Housing First University course evaluation. I will be putting a link to that course evaluation in the chat at the end of the session, and I'll also be emailing it to you following today's session. I think maybe our session is short enough that we might not take a short break today. I think we might try and power through because we have a lot to get to. But worry not, the slides and some other tip sheets will be emailed to you following the training. So don't feel like you need to furiously write everything down. So here we go. Our agenda today. We are going to talk about some common boundary issues. As I mentioned, or as we've mentioned, we come from kind of that supportive housing background. And so our lens on boundary issues does tend to be around housing supports, but also the broader mental health and substance use space. We are going to talk about some ideas around countertransference in brief, but we want to really focus on how do we manage those feelings. We're going to define what an ethical dilemma is, and we'll explore some ways that we can respond to ethical dilemmas. And then we'll talk about confidentiality and HIPAA in brief, and have a chance for some Q&A. So our learning objectives for this session are to identify the 6 steps used for addressing ethical dilemmas in the workplace. So I want to offer us kind of a stepwise approach that you could apply to most ethical dilemmas. We want to spend time defining countertransference and give some examples of how it may impact client relationships. And we want to be able to explain confidentiality and its limits and your professional role. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Khalil to get us started with boundaries.
All righty. Ryan, you have slide control, right? Okay, awesome. So what we see on the screen here are really some reflection questions to help us understand what boundaries are, when we use them, and in like the webinar format, we can't unmute and you can't share or talk in this way, I don't think. But if you have any immediate responses to anything you see on the screen here, feel free to shoot them off in the chat. For example, understanding what professional boundaries in the workplace do. If you have a good idea or a feeling about what that means or what that means in your specific job context, go ahead and fire that off in the chat. Maybe even share why you feel like boundaries are important or the problems that come up from maybe like a lack of boundaries in the professional or working spaces that we exist in. So while you're thinking of that or thinking of some examples of why boundaries are important, I just want to name that we all have them, right? We all have boundaries in our personal life and in our professional life. And sometimes these look a little different, right? And I think the way that we'll talk about boundaries, ethics, and confidentiality today is mostly going to be around boundaries in the professional space, in the working space as helping professionals. Just a quick definition of professional boundaries that we like to share is that professional boundaries are the limits of the relationship of a member of staff, so us, the providers, and a person in our care, which allow for a safe therapeutic connection between the staff and that person, and their nominated partners, family, and friends, protecting both staff and patient family. So sometimes when we ask this question about like, why are boundaries important? We hear that a lot, right? For safety of our clients or patients or residents, and safety in our safety, right? As providers, our job security might be on the line if we're not adhering to specific professional boundaries. Our like emotional, mental, and like physical safety might be at risk if we are not adhering to some specific boundaries in the workplace. So having boundaries in place limits our exposure to stress and our production of stress hormones, right? If our boundaries are respected by others, and probably if I'm respecting other boundaries as well, I'm going to be less stressed in the workplace. And that to me sounds like a great remedy for things like vicarious trauma and burnout, right? When we can set some expectations on the front end, we might be a little less stressed when folks know what they're coming into our space with, know the things that they can and can't ask, or the buttons they can or can't push, right? So overall, in a nutshell, we think that boundaries keep us safe, right? And that is kind of the main kind of driving force for us setting these boundaries, keep us safe, and then the folks that we serve safe as well. I don't see any examples in the chat, but if anything comes up for anybody and you're like, here's why boundaries are important in my own job context or in my agency, feel free to go ahead and share them here.
I do see one comment from Jennifer in the chat. It says self-care. And I think you're speaking to that in terms of limiting our stress. Self-care, the self-care of boundaries, like I'm going to stay until 5 and then I'm going to go home, right? Like that is good self-care. Or like I'm going to put away these client files and stop working on them after hours. That's good self-care. So I think you're right on, Jennifer. And if you have other examples of the way that boundaries represent self-care, would love to hear that from you as well.
Yes, absolutely. Let's see. Sorry, I'm moving some things around on my screen. All right, Ryan, I think we're ready for the next slide. Self-disclosure. So now we're moving on to some examples of where and when boundaries are probably super important, or we have questions about them more in these specific scenarios. So one of those things, or one of those spaces, is the idea of self-disclosure. Um, Ryan and I think have spent a lot of our like professional lives in this space saying words like this and just assuming everybody knows what it is. And we actually did a training a couple weeks ago, and someone's like, well, what is self-disclosure? Right. So I think that's important to probably start off with first. But self-disclosure is going to be anything that we are disclosing to a client about ourselves, about our personal lives, right? If there are peer specialists in this group or recovery specialists, I think that there are job roles where it might be really part of somebody's job or is assumed by their title, um, that there are instances and situations and environments where self-disclosure is going to be really important, or as part of their role, right? Disclosing that this is my lived experience, right? How can I support you, knowing that we have this thing in common, might be a way a CRS or a CPS navigates a self-disclosure, right? But it doesn't mean that there are no boundaries in that space either, right? And that, of course, is going to be up to the person typically. Um, but we do believe that best practice is to use self-disclosure and be disclosing personal information with as much discretion as possible, right? Asking ourselves, am I sharing this for the benefit of the participant or myself, is going to be super important here. Um, if there are any social workers in the group or anybody who's taken like the social work licensing exam, this is something that comes up often, right? When do we use self-disclosure? The answer is always like when it's in the benefit of the participant or of the client, the patient, whatever. Um, and if you find this coming up for you, is like, I'm going to work and all I want to do is share about my own life, right? That might be a signal of something else, right? We might need our own supports at that point. We might need our own kind of peer support group situations. We might need our own kind of therapist or mental health, or phoning in a friend more often, or learning how to have those conversations or being communicative about those things outside of the workspace. Um, but yeah, this idea of asking ourselves why we're sharing, what is, the benefit of the client or the person on the receiving end, we think it is probably best practice, right? And then also considering timing. I think this is just a good tip for like all of our interactions with participants, right? The idea of, so we also train in like crisis intervention de-escalation, right? We don't want to be sharing like rules and policies like at the peak of a crisis, right? And I think the same thing about self-disclosure. If someone's having a meltdown right in your face, you don't want to say, oh, don't do this. I've done this before, right? I've had a meltdown in my life also. We want to consider the timing and context of our self-disclosure. But then also this last point is important as well. Our agency might have a specific policy about self-disclosure. Maybe it's you don't self-disclose to clients at all. I can see this being probably having the most context in probably like forensic settings, places where we are like working with like actively incarcerated folks. I think sometimes this is something that is shared or is like written policy. That's one of the examples I can think about for, does your agency policy say something about self-disclosure? Yeah, in a nutshell, disclosing things or parts of our lives with as much discretion as possible, and when we think it might benefit our client.
And I wanted to add here, you offer some good examples of like the way that peer specialists and certified recovery specialists navigate the self-disclosure space. It is like a core part of their job. And so they often have sharpened skills in that respect that I think many of us can learn from. But I also want to say that like self-disclosure, part of the context is who I'm talking to and where I'm talking to them, right? And so I might be very comfortable sharing with a client that I also was unhoused at one point, but that doesn't mean that that level of comfort that I sit with makes it appropriate for me to share it with every single client that I work with, right? And so we have to be comfortable with what we're sharing, but we also have to be cognizant about who we're sharing it with and where. Maybe I'm willing to share that information when I'm doing street outreach, but I might be less willing to share that information once somebody is already in their unit, right? It really is going to depend on the context and feeling out the potential benefits of sharing this, not just, oh, I'm cool with sharing my homelessness status or history, and therefore I will share it with everybody, right? We're always assessing the value of it, even if we're very comfortable with a piece of information. Yes, I've been in NA communities for 20 years. Do I need to share that with everybody? Maybe not, right? And so kind of always checking that against the value that it provides for a client.
Thanks, Ryan. So another space that we should really be thinking about the boundaries we have in place or the expectations we have for our interactions with the folks that we serve is the idea of dual relationships, right? If we live and work in the same communities as the folks that we're serving, the likelihood that we experience our members or our service population outside of the setting is going to be significantly higher, right? Um, and then also, that next bullet point talks about 12-step fellowship specifically, right? If you're part of NA and AA, and you also work with clients or like a population that often frequents like NA and AA groups, right? This might be something that we need to talk about on the front end in being creative and how we are navigating, or being clear, maybe not creative, but clear about how we're navigating seeing folks outside of the workspace. So your agency, again, might have a written policy about this already, right? But when in doubt, we can also keep our supervisors in the loop. And I also think there are many instances where this is left up to individual providers and your own clarity or expectations around how you are or are not interacting with folks when you see them in the community. So that idea of sharing space, right? If we live in the same communities that we're serving, which I think really is best case scenario for folks, right? Um, we it's like we might use the same supermarket, right? We probably might use the same public transportation. I know that is the case at Pathways. Um, and something that I think I realized much later in like my working life is that if I live and work in Philadelphia forever, right, I'm going to see these participants in different areas, right? When I leave this specific job, right, when I left my role at Pathways, that wasn't the end of my work with Pathways participants, right? I saw them either on public, I saw them at stores in my community. I might have seen them in other agencies that I've worked at or worked with, right? But I think one of the important pieces here is being able to understand what these door relationships might look like for you, and maybe having a conversation on the front end with a participant. Hey, if I see you out in the community, if we see one another out in the community, how do you want to proceed? Right. And this isn't going to be the same for everybody. We want to make sure that those interactions are still appropriate. Even if somebody is okay with a hello, we need to know this isn't like a stop and engage in like a brief therapy moment right now, right? And go about our days, or we're not doing the case management thing out in the community if that's not our job or written into our role, right? But is it okay for me to say hello to you? Would you rather me not say anything at all? Um, and I think that's something that is like consistently workshopped. In my own life, I was working at a therapy practice and stopped hearing from somebody for quite some time. They just kind of like fell off the radar, stopped coming to sessions. And then one day, my partner and I were at a dog park with my dog, and my like previous client that just fell off the radar also walked into the dog park, and I'm sitting here like, oh no. And she like beeline toward me, friend in a friendly way, walked right up to me, right? In my head, I'm like, what do I say to my partner? What do I say to this person, right? About who this person is in my space. This example actually just came to mind in the dual relationship sort of space. But I just let her say hello, and she started asking questions about like therapy treatment, and I let her know my new email, like my new work email, where she could reach out and like ask me. Uh, mental health questions or about like starting treatment again. But after that, it was like we were talking about our dogs, right? Which felt like a much better dual relationship based on that environment and that context is a conversation I'd probably have with anybody else at the dog park, right? About their dog and what our dogs like to do and how they're interacting and things like that. And giving that person the ability to follow up on their own about things that we maybe should talk about in a different setting. So that's a fun example I like to think about. But I think some of the more common ones are like community events, public transit, if you take public transit. Um, what else? Shopping. I have a friend who is a teacher, and she's always talking about her students like freaking out when they see her like in public, right? Like, oh, you're a real person. You exist outside of like the classroom. She's an elementary school teacher. And that's what I think about here as well. And it's probably different for a teacher than it is like a helping professional where you are receiving specific or like specialized treatment, whereas everybody goes to school kind of, right? So yeah, just something important to be thinking about. And I think if we had like a to-do for this slide or door relationships, it might be talking about this at intake, talking about this when you first meet a client, if you know you're likely to see them in other spaces, NA, AA, the community, in that sort of setting. So this is another kind of like buzzword in I think the helping profession, right? The idea of transference and countertransference. I actually think we spend a lot more time talking about countertransference, right? How our participants or the folks that we're serving are reacting to us, what we represent to them. Um, but I mean, I'm sorry. We spend a lot of time talking about transference. I mixed up some terms in my head. I had to read the slide, teach myself briefly, but here we are, right? Transference. I think we spend a lot of time here. But this is the client's unconscious projection of feelings on us, right? We represent something in their lives that isn't necessarily the here and now, isn't necessarily you, but something about you. It might be physical characteristics, it might be specific mannerisms, or the way we talk, or the way we dress, um, that represent something from the client's past. Typically, we're talking about this in a way that is typically negative, but that doesn't have to be the case. You also might represent something really super positive and like comforting to a participant as well, right? They might associate you with something really great. And on the other end of that, they may associate you with something that is maybe not so safe and welcoming, right? Um, it's important to know that that's likely not a you thing, right? Not an us thing in those spaces. But we might be having interactions where the client is acting or behaving in that way, right? So this includes all reactions that the client has to the social worker, can be associated with somebody else. But also mostly revolves around the idea of distortions, right? Kind of conflating these things or this time and these places and these people, right? That really can serve to be separated, but there might be some challenges in doing that right there and then. Now, I've worked with folks in my life who are saying, like, I don't want to work with a man, right? That is very important to acknowledge on the front end, right? If there are specific identity pieces that are going to make this work more challenging for this person or more stressful, that might not be work that is cut out for, that might not be very healthy work for somebody. And I think that those are the instances that we really need to be listening to when somebody's able to communicate that. They're not going to say, oh, Khalil, I'm having some transference right now, right? You remind me of this thing. But they might say, hey, my trauma really revolves around like intimate spaces with men, right? And what is the therapy space, right? It can be quite intimate and vulnerable, right? So, but this exists outside of the therapy space as well. This could be a case manager or just anybody we're sharing vulnerable information to or harder information with. Um, yeah.
I saw
So
an example in the chat of a person who works in homeless outreach, and they say that transference is real in that setting. And I've asked for a clarification about like what sort of transference is happening. But I'm imagining that when you're doing outreach with people, they put a whole bunch of stuff on you that may or may not be true about you, right? And so this whole difficulty about gaining trust with somebody who's like living rough on the street, maybe for a long time, part of the reason why it's so tough to gain trust with those folks is because you represent a bunch of stuff that you don't think you represent, or that like is not really how you see yourself. But like you're a government worker, or um, you're some version of surveillance or a cop or something like that. And negative experiences have happened to folks. And so I think Kylo's point around like the trauma that somebody has experienced can be really tied very closely to their transference and how they like project that onto you. And I think that's a great point also that he made, that like they don't always know that that's happening, right? It's unconscious that it's happening. It's like, get away from me, but can't say why, can't say what you represent, right? And so we're constantly working with people's transference in this space.
Yeah, and I also think like when we know about this thing, it's easy to internalize and to speculate and analyze a client's behaviors and reactions to you, right? But I also want to encourage the idea and just normalizing the idea of like talking about these things or naming these things, right? Like, is there something about me that makes this really, and not asking in a way that feels confrontational or like we're about to box one another, right? Asking in a way where like you where it feels safe to like give the information that you're soliciting from somebody, right? And I think all these things are so much easier than said than done, but also um, somebody needs to feel safe. Sure, we could say, let me know if you feel uncomfortable, right? But what are we doing to like signal comfort and safety for somebody so that next session they can come back here and be like, actually, Kalo, that doesn't feel correct, or I don't feel like you interpreted my experience correctly or the way that is like true to me. Um, is important. And that is like hard feedback to receive initially, but I think like opening that door gives us an opportunity to practice what it's like to hear that, sit with that, and then adjust, right? If we think work with that client is possible. Um, I worked with folks where like sometimes transference is kind of a healthy challenge, right? I'm working with an individual right now whose trauma revolves around um, some relationships with men of color. And this is why this person sought out a therapist who was a person of color, me. Um, um, and the way we frame this in our therapy space is like this is like a healthy exposure to hopefully a healthy exposure, right? And a safe exposure to what a relationships like this can potentially look like in your life, right? Um, that is not something that we should be pushing for, right? We can like offer that if someone is able to name instances of transference, right? But we never want to push for somebody to meet with us if we are representing something that is unsafe. Also, transference doesn't always revolve around safety. Sometimes it is like attitude, just like general like demeanor, dislike, right? I don't like you, I don't like people like you are like what you represent, right? I think about race as well. There might be some like discomfort or things that don't feel good if we that come with the assumptions we have about race and people who hold specific identities, right? Now we can do all the work we can to check our own biases and things like that, right? But on the client's end, that's not really our role typically, is to change these things about somebody. But yeah, we can certainly be having those conversations and talk about like safe exposure if that is an appropriate setting to be doing that. Alrighty, countertransference. So we talked a lot about just now a client's reactions to me, right? To us. Now we're talking about our reactions to participants, the folks that we serve. It's important to know that they happen, right? We have reactions to participants. They do remind us of people or experiences or settings and environments that we've had interactions with. And again, negative interactions or really positive interactions, right? Um, so this is going to be our unconscious responses to clients' projections, to who they are, what they bring to the space. Um, and that will typically result from our own unresolved stuff that are triggered by the client. But I also want to be, this could also look like something like favoritism or going above and beyond, right? For a client that you think needs a little more protection because of your own stuff, right? Because of your own life experiences or what you believe to be true about the world or about this person, right? Um, Countertransference can also look like that. Could also look like you feeling more drained after like signing some paperwork with a participant or just interacting with them for a specific session, whether that is like a phone call, therapy, case management, whatever, right? Um, are we feeling more drained or more activated when we have interactions with specific participants, and why or where does that come from? Um, is it about the participant, or is it about me and my own stuff and what I'm holding in this space? So again, these are informed by our own personal histories, our own values and beliefs, right? I've seen this in homelessness settings, right? Like we can all work in this space, right? And really believe that folks deserve housing, but we can still have so many different ideas around how that housing is obtained, who deserves it, who doesn't, right? Which doesn't even feel good for me to say because I typically don't think I belong in that camp. I would love for everybody to have housing. But even when we make it to I think that speaks to, like the differences in like opinion when we make it to these spaces, right? I'm talking about biases and not making the assumption that all of us in the same space have the same values and beliefs about a person's care or treatment. Um, so our own cultural backgrounds and influences is also a contributing factor to countertransference. It might look like recommending or not recommending specific parenting techniques because of the way you were parented or the way you are a parent, right? I parent in this way. I think it's really good. I think you should do the same thing. I don't think that'd be the actual language used, but I think that's an example of our own stuff influencing our work with the folks that we serve. Anything to add here, Ryan? Or any questions anybody wants to fire off in the chat or examples of transference or countertransference in your workplace?
Yeah, what I wanted to add was just like some more examples. And so I agree. I'm putting out that call. Just wanted to hear your examples of countertransference and what this has been like to navigate for you. But I think a fun thing to talk about is the way that countertransference actually can feel good, right? Even though it's countertransference, I think has this like negative connotation when we say it out loud. Oh no, you can't be like activated and responsive to your countertransference. That's not good. You have to examine that and confront it. But things like, do you have a favorite client? That's countertransference. Do you have somebody who you think is so good at working the program and you're excited to see them like move all the way through the alumni program and not need your support anymore? That's great. And also that's countertransference, right? Like that those feelings that you have. Um, so some other examples, dreading or eagerly anticipating seeing a client. Those are examples of countertransference. When we're thinking excessively about a client, right? Like maybe you go home and you still kind of problem solving in your head about that person. That's countertransference. I love this example that we have written in our notes. Having difficulty understanding a client's problem. When we can't wrap our head around the decisions people are making, or like what's going on with this problem, if I literally can't understand this problem, this challenge, that's countertransference, right? Because we're operating from our own beliefs and biases and thoughts. And so that doesn't align with the experiences of the client, right? And then finally, being bored by certain clients. This client is so boring. I can't stand to talk to them. They don't have anything to talk about. That's countertransference, right? So those are some more examples. I see a comment in the chat from RC Weber. This may be outside of most of our roles, but the therapeutic use of client transference is something taught in some schools of thought in pastoral care and mental health counseling. Yeah, and maybe you have more to say about this, Kalo, but like transference is natural and normal when clients project onto us, and we can alter. I think Kalo's example of working with a client who wanted to interact more with people of color, that's like an example of using that transference to heal something. Do you have anything more to add there, Kalo?
Yeah. So in the past year, there's been kind of like a new word or new phrase floating around like the therapeutic space. Um, I think it's a psych PhD. Her name is Jennifer Mullen. She wrote a book called Decolonizing Therapy. And I think it actually deals with this specifically, right? What does it look like to bring identity into these spaces, which is something I really appreciate in my own therapy space, naming these things on the front end, what they bring up and what we're going to do about it, right? Because the idea that what I bring and my whole history like isn't going to exist in this space and yours isn't going to be existing in the space and it doesn't impact your life or what you bring to the table is just so unrealistic, right? So how do we talk about moving through uh, life's challenges or our own mental health concerns or our life concerns in a way where like I can't talk about any of these things, right? So I think I appreciate this perspective right here that RC Weber like named in the chat. And um, I don't think we're talking about transference or countertransference in a way that it is a bad thing, right? Something that we are just recommending we need to be aware of and know that it does impact the spaces that we work in, right? I don't think that means like these are secrets and we don't talk about them. I think quite the opposite. We should be talking about like how we are feeling. We appropriately so, right? Like our reactions to clients should be expressed in a way that is manageable, safe, and appropriate for a client to hold. And only you make that decision or are able to make that decision. But I think that also leads us quite cleanly into the next slide, Ryan. Um, our reactions, right? So if countertransference and transference are going to be commonplace in our workspaces, and just really all the space we take up when we're working with client populations, um, we really the best we can do is monitor ourselves and our own reactions, right? This is another thing we talk about in like the crisis space, right? The best thing we can do is really monitor the self. In our own reactions and responses to this. A really kind of really a fun phrase, I think a healthy phrase to reflect on that I appreciate in like the mindfulness and meditation space is the idea of responding and not reacting, right? What can I do to respond to what this person is bringing to this space or what's coming up for me, rather than react intensely or vulnerably if it's not appropriate in that specific circumstance, I think is important. What can I do to respond to this transference or countertransference and not react in a way that might jeopardize this relationship or harm my participant? Um, so yeah, this first bullet says that these responses are only problematic when they cause the worker's decision making to be based on his or her feelings, not on the client's goals, right? So I think, well, I think we think that self-identified goals are best case scenario for the folks that we work with. Um, and where transference or countertransference is the biggest issue is if we're letting our own feelings and stuff influence the shape of those goals or the treatment space. Um, if anybody has any examples of when you might have made decisions based on your emotional responses to participants and did not take into account their goals, feel free to fire them off in the chat. That seems like a little vulnerable. I'm trying to rack my brain to see if I can kick us off with an example. Um, I think I have an example that doesn't pertain to the idea of goals, but just like a client interaction. And I share this in a lot of different training contexts, but I once worked with, at Pathways, I was working with somebody on our team who was experiencing homelessness, had a substance use disorder, um, had a schizophrenia diagnosis, and was also like very actively symptomatic and not medicated. And our team was this participant's payee. We received his money, and one time we owed him some cash. Like the agency took out too whatever, messed something up, and we had $200 for him in our safe that I was planning to give to him when he came to the office. And that's what happened, right? He came to the office. I handed him this $200 in cash. And the next thing he did was rip it. He tore it right down the middle in my face and just walked away, right? My impulse, my gut reaction was to grab the money, right? To remove this from his hands because I knew he needed it, right? He was experiencing homelessness, very active addiction. I was like, wow, he could really use this money, right? But that idea of me going to like take this money is very much a me thing, right? Me believing, and I felt like knowing he needs this, he won't survive without it, blah, blah, blah. Money's great, solves a lot of issues, is what I was thinking in the moment, right? My relationship to money, my belief about what this person needed in the moment was money. So my reaction was to take this, right? But this person, for some reason, felt unsafe, and we talked about why.
Did Khalil just freeze up?
Yeah, I think he may have crashed.
Uh-oh.
Glad to know that you can still hear me though.
Yes.
Okay. Um, yeah, so I think Kala was just making the larger point that when we're not aligned with what the client's goals are or what they need, we may be operating from that place of countertransference, right? And so acknowledging that difference, rather than getting defensive or attributing it to other things, I think is the key there. Okay. Thinking through further how to manage countertransference, want to offer these kind of effective versus ineffective approaches. So when we're dealing with countertransference, when we're dealing with projections, often unconscious, but these feelings that we have toward clients, and again, really emphasizing this is not just a therapist skill set, right? All of us and all of our roles are going to be dealing with transference and countertransference. And so what's going to be useful for us is to do this work around self-insight, right? And we have to do this through supervision, right? So thinking, we can ask ourselves some questions to develop our insight, right? I can say to myself, who does this client remind me of? Like I'm having a reaction. Is there some person this person reminds me of? Oh my gosh, that uncle that I hated, or that uncle that I loved, or that other client that I had 2.5 years ago. This person reminds me of that person, right? And so that first step of insight is really to explore like where is their familiarity here? Um, or I might ask the question, which of my own painful experiences are being stirred by our work, right? I'm having a hard time working with this client and I'm not sure why. Is there some painful experience that is floating around in my head that maybe I need to examine again? Which judgments about a client am I making based on my own values? And I think we do this all the time, right? Oh my gosh, that client is such a hard worker. They're a great client. Or, oh my goodness, this client, we're just enabling this client. They don't really want help or things like that. These are judgments we're making. And so it's worth interrogating those judgments that we have based on the values that we hold. They may not be true for that person, right? When we ask questions or make comments toward clients that seem to be emotionally weighted, I can ask myself, what am I hoping to accomplish by making this comment or asking that question, right? Am I really meeting my own needs by asking this question or making that comment? I can ask myself, are my objectives congruent with client goals? Like, what do I want to achieve out of this interaction? And does that match client goals? I need to be exploring that really carefully. If I could do that interaction all over again, would I do the same thing? I love this question, right? Because with the benefit of hindsight, our emotional reactions are a little bit tamped down, and we can ask ourselves, did I do the right thing there, right? If I could do this all again, would I do it the right way? And if our answer is no, perhaps our earlier action was influenced by our countertransference. And again, you're not a bad worker for um, being responsive to your countertransference. You're being a human being, right? But we have to do this work of self-insight to do that. And then I can also ask myself, would I have acted the same way with another client who was in a similar situation, right? And so I did this with this client, but I had another client, would I do the same thing with them? And if the answer is no, or if I would have treated them in a different way, um, maybe that's representing the countertransference that I experienced, right? So just looking at this first bullet point of what is effective in managing countertransference, And doing some work around self-insight is really effective. Hi, Kylo, welcome back.
Hello. Thanks. Sorry, folks. I felt like I was on a roll, and also the
Yeah,
call was so smooth. I was still talking for a little bit, and then I was like, wait a minute, where did everybody go? Sorry about that.
no worries. Do you want to say any more about like what is effective? Just really, I kind of explored that first bullet point and some of these questions we can ask ourselves to develop insight. Anything else you wanted to add to this managing countertransference component?
Yeah, I think that the idea of empathy, that next bullet point and what can maybe be effective is something that we sounds kind of fluffy sometimes. Be like, be empathetic. We know we're helping professionals, right? But when we really think about what this looks like in practice, right, what we can be doing um, to be executing this, I think is one way we can also help manage counter transference, right? This person is bringing this thing up for me, but also like what's coming up for me, my reactions, what's going on in my body might not have anything to do with me, right? And if you feel like you're able to successfully do that, I think it's completely fine to be working with a participant or continue working with a participant. For some reason that is unmanageable for you, I think the use of supervision um, and troubleshooting that with kind of your own supervisors or your own like therapeutic supports is really important. And it's not a deficiency in you, right? To need to switch gears or refer this person to somebody else. I think that only you will know like when something feels like a healthy and appropriate challenge for you in the care that you can provide for somebody, or when you know that the care you're providing for somebody is going to maybe suffer because of your reactions to somebody, right? And I think that's an important piece to think about when we think about empathy. Sure, we can try to put ourselves in the other person's shoes all we want, right? If I am very consistently activated and that is impacting my care, this might be something I need to step away from. So I also think the idea of stepping back, right, might be an effective way to be managing countertransference if it's negatively impacting the work that you're going to do with a participant. Um, so some of the other things we can do is manage our own anxiety. Um, oh, and again, utilizing supervision is on here. I think that's also a very important space. And I think this can be your direct supervisor, right? If they are a helping professional familiar with these ideas, but it also can be in the form of like, I think a peer supervision group too. How have you navigated countertransference in the work setting? I think sometimes it's really great feedback to be hearing from other people and like really combats that idea that we're doing this alone. Um, so what's going to be ineffective is acting like it's not there, right? Pretending this doesn't exist, nothing's coming up for you when you work with this person. It is not going to be helpful here. So this says avoidance of client material that is related to your unresolved issues, right? Ignoring client issues. I think race and identity stuff is a perfect example, right? An example I like to give is in some traditional like outpatient therapy settings, a client might walk into the therapy office and say, I had this really racist interaction. This is what somebody said to me, blah, blah, blah. I'm mad about it, X, Y, and Z. If the therapist's reaction is, oh, like, that's so sad. Sorry that happened. That's okay because I'm not racist, right? We are avoiding that client material. We're avoiding what that client is coming to the space with and saying, this is a problem for me, right? Um, and maybe that comes from our own kind of discomfort in addressing things that revolve around race or identity, right? Um, what we do know is what that client is expressing is not being addressed because of your own stuff, because you don't want to talk about race. That sounded very like passionate and targeted. I don't believe that's anybody in this group, but is a thing like that can happen. Um, yeah, that's what I've got.
And I wanted to make a distinction, and I think you said this well, but in like two separate ways, which is that stepping back from interactions that we're concerned may actually be causing harm is a different thing than avoiding client material that's related to your unresolved issues, right? And so I just want to like say that clearly that like we can be acknowledging our own countertransference and choosing a course of action that results in less harm to people. Alternatively, um, we can look at the client issues, do our own work and our own therapy, or talk to our colleagues or whatever and resolve those issues, or lean into those issues in a way that's not avoidance. And both of those things could be effective. Those are different things, though, those statements that Kalo made. And I just wanted to be clear about that.
Yeah, thanks for that clarity, Ryan. Um, I think I want to review some of these questions that we may ask ourselves when addressing these things.
Oh, I did a couple of these already just
Oh,
while you
okay.
were, yeah, coming on. If there's any like one or two that you like are favorites of yours, feel free, but we talked about some of these already.
Nope, that feel pretty solid
Cool.
there.
All right.
So acknowledging our humanity is the thing or one of the things we can be doing about this, right? So I think we started talking around this already. We can start naming these things, discussing them, weighing whether or not it makes sense to like step back or lean into some support in like addressing these things. But it's important to know these are common challenges, right? Um, the goal shouldn't be like, what can I do to get rid of my countertransference, right? It should just be, what am I doing to address my countertransference when it comes up, right? We are not resistant to this. It's a very common thing to be happening for folks. Um, Chances are, if you made it to like the space that you work in and you're in like this specific Zoom meeting, you are a very feeling person, right? We don't choose these careers and these jobs because um, we're cold and callous, right? It's quite the opposite, I think, many times. So the fact that we like are feeling is normal, especially for probably who you are and what you bring to the helping profession. So um, just to repeat this one more time, right? No one's immune from countertransference. It's something that we should probably expect to come up, but have a game plan for how we want to be addressing this. Um, and honoring impact over intention. I think what we mean here is that we might have really good intentions, right? But our delivery or the way we're interacting with somebody might not land the way we intend it to, right? So if we are trying to like really dig through and sort through our counter transference and somebody is just like confused about our interactions or not feeling great, I think that's important to know and to notice, right? And be like, okay, maybe this example where I'm stepping back or reaching out for additional support for me, so that I can better support this client, because I have really good intentions, right? But the impact on this client isn't necessarily what I had hoped it would be, or isn't me successfully moving through counter transference. Anything to add here, Ryan?
No, no, I think that's right. And it just brings me back to like the main point of this whole section on countertransference is that like we may be like inadvertently our feelings and the things we think maybe inadvertently making our own jobs of supporting people in housing solutions harder, right? If we're only kind of operating through this lens of countertransference. And so the impact that we're having may far outweigh the fact that we consider ourselves helpers and we all we want to do is help people, and I have this great intention to like be with people and support them in their housing journey, right? So we have a responsibility, I think, to like deal with this countertransference effectively. And if you are a human being in the helping profession, you are dealing with countertransference. Like you must, right? Like it is a part of your work, whether you're a peer specialist or a therapist or a case manager or a supervisor, like it's present for all of us. So that's, I think, largely what's meant by that impact is greater than intention part.
Yeah, and I see some notes now that I think this is a really helpful way for understanding this as well. Do we mean to cause harm? No, absolutely not. Right? Do we still cause harm sometimes? Yeah, probably. Right? And it's a hard thing to say and to admit. We don't get into these careers because we want to be doing that. We want to really be doing the opposite. But acknowledging that that is the potential sometimes is going to be important here. Am I the best person to be doing this work? I think is just an important reflection question for us to have. Next point is making sure our own needs are being met. So we're still talking about boundaries here, right? And I think that there are boundaries to be included in this statement or this idea, right? Should I be going to work if I had 2 hours of sleep and my job involves like working with people, right? I think that's a tricky space to be like, this is a boundary, right? But clients are on the other end of that. Should a client be interacting with you when you've had 2 hours of sleep? Probably not, right? Um, it's our job as providers to make sure our own needs are being met outside of the therapeutic relationship, right? So, or outside of our work setting, so that we can be showing up fully for our jobs. And Yes, we are talking about boundaries in like the professional setting, and I think there is a connection there, right? One of the ways I like to talk about self-care in a therapy space is what does it look like to make you your responsibility, right? All the responsibilities you have in the world, right? What are we doing to like prioritize ourselves so that we can show up in the world and address our other responsibilities, right? And in this space, we're talking about our responsibilities to our clients and the folks that we serve. Um, and I think just to wrap this up, this last kind of reflection statement is what we can handle versus what should be passed off to another team member, right? Our personal issues will come up in some client relationships. This is inevitable, right? And our responsibility is to acknowledge which things we can handle and which things need to be passed off or which things we need to kind of integrate some more support for in addressing, right? Um, yeah, that's what I've got here.
That's great. Thank you so much for walking us through all that, Kalo. Just so that we're consistent and making sure that people's comments are being uplifted, just want to kind of shout out Jennifer had an example of countertransference. Jennifer does outreach, and so they said kind of like having a favorite in a certain camp and providing bus passes for appointments, knowing they'll probably be traded for drugs. Um, I think there's a couple of examples of countertransference, in fact, in this example. Yes, that is a countertransference to like have a favorite and to be uplifting their needs, maybe more than some of the other members of the camp. I think it's another example of a countertransference to kind of make this assumption that they're going to um, trade those bus passes for drugs, and that might be a bad thing, right? That comes from a place of like values and beliefs for us, right? And even if that is exactly the case of what's going to happen, to pretend that there's not kind of a stigma attached to um, spending resources on drugs, especially if you're unhoused, there's a lot of like social stuff built into that, right? So I think that's a great example. Um, RC is just now chiming in saying things might need to be passed off owing to either the therapist or the client's history. Definitely, not just our own, right? That's a great point, RC. I can recall one male client in particular who did okay with me and thrived with my female assistant after revealing some of his personal history, right? So it wasn't like it was a negative relationship with you, but it was a much more positive and growth oriented one when that client got connected with the your female assistant. So yeah, that's a great example too, and being able to kind of acknowledge those things. And again, I don't, you're not doing this, RC, but I want us to be really clear that this is not just for therapists, right? This is anybody in a helping relationship can experience countertransference and can be faced with transference from clients.
Yeah, I think I have one more like professional setting example that I think is helpful to be thinking about this through. If we work with children or if we work with like folks with like some behaviors that could impact children, like substance use, right? Our own beliefs about what reporting measures do or don't do to a family or a family system might influence whether or not we do or don't report it, even though we know that our job is telling us to act in a specific way in this specific scenario, right? If we suspect child abuse, what we probably should be doing is reporting it, right? I think in many states, I'm only licensed in Pennsylvania. I've only taken Pennsylvania licensure exams, but I do think it is like the norm to like suspect, report, and then follow up with your supervisors. A lot of times our agencies are flipping that around, kind of meet with me first, then report this, right? Um, that's not why I'm naming this. I'm naming this to say, when it comes to like reporting suspected child abuse, right? I might have in my head like, oh no, I really, really don't want to do this. I know this could really mess up a family system. I know this is going to jeopardize the relationship I have with Arcelia, whoever, right? And I'm having a lot of feelings. I'm feeling very activated by having to make this decision, right? That is counter transfer. That is transference. That is my reaction to, I'm sorry, that is countertransference. That is what is coming up for me in the situation, even though there might be a professional and agency boundary or policy that says, here is the boundary I need to have. Here is what I need to do in these next steps. I think this is another maybe pretty known and felt example of when countertransference might come up for us.
Yeah, it's a good example. Thank you. Okay. We're at the top of the hour. Yeah, yeah. RC just chiming in. Yep, mandated reporting is true in all states. And yeah, you can have that preference to inform the client and make the report with the client present. That's not a requirement though. And in fact, if a person faces, at least in Pennsylvania, if a person faces negative consequences for reporting first and talking to the supervisor second, that's illegal. An agency can't force you to do that, even though they consider it best practice or they want to know. Because you're a mandated reporter as an individual, you don't have to take that step. You can just make the report.
Yeah, and I feel like I want to just, I know I don't need to, but my own countertransference is coming up here and feeling like I should name something. I am aware that each state has its own reporting measures or like guidelines, but that is the thing, right? These are not like standard across all 50 states. So in Pennsylvania, we might suspect and report, right? In another state, I think just neighboring in New Jersey, it might not look like this, or we might need some sort of collection of data or information first, right? Um, which doesn't sound that sounds scary, right? But I don't think these things are very standardized, and maybe they should be. I don't know. Maybe that flexibility is good. Um, but I think the idea of this being specific to agencies, and our agencies probably have something written about this, really informs the professional boundaries that we do have, right? My agency policies probably dictates my boundaries in my work setting.
Okay, I think we're ready to move into ethics. Ethics is always tangly and thorny and tough. And one of the things that I like to say when we're examining case studies, for example, and we're trying to make correct ethical decisions, is that there is no right answer for many of these things. Inherently, ethical decision making um, can feel unsatisfying, I think. And we'll talk about why, and we'll talk about ways that we can untangle some of that and make the best decision for the most amount of people, right? So wanting to just define an ethical dilemma for us, right? Get on the same page. What is an ethical dilemma? An ethical dilemma occurs when a service provider encounters a conflict among their professional duties and values and must decide which takes precedence. So we all have a set of um, tasks and a set of professional and human values that we're walking through the world with. And sometimes those values will come into conflict with one another, right? It's an ethical dilemma because this thing that I think is in conflict with this other thing that I think. For example, I believe in client autonomy almost at the very tippy top of my hierarchy of values, right? But if a client was hurting themselves, I really don't want to see clients hurt themselves, right? And so those things are, in opposition to one another. I may do something that takes somebody's autonomy, even though I really care so much about autonomy, right? And so that's what causes the dilemma, where I'm trying to decide whether this one value that I hold supersedes this other value that I also hold, right? So want to kind of just dive into this a little bit further about what is an ethical dilemma. And having taught in graduate school for MSW students, and I wonder if Kalo can probably attest to this as well. But I want to suggest that in the helping professions, there are certainly ethical and also non-ethical aspects of this work, right? And so when I say the non-ethical components of the work, I'm thinking about things like, um, which intervention techniques are we going to use? How do we write our notes? Where do we conduct our practice? Is it in the field? Is it in an office setting? And so in and of themselves, these are the tasks that are just kind of like part of our practice or part of the business decisions that are happening in our field. And that's going to require the development of certain skills, certain techniques. We acquire certain knowledge to be able to do that stuff well, but don't necessarily involve the ability to judge between what's right and wrong, right? And so on the flip side of that, are the ethical aspects of our helping professions that include things like, the obligations and duties we have about what is morally right and wrong in carrying out our practice, right? And so there is this moral component to this work, not just the kind of technical aspects of the work. Am I doing the right thing, right? And so I mentioned that graduate school students, I think sometimes have a challenge with this. They go into their internships. It's sometimes their first exposure to client-facing work, and they'll come back and tell their field staff that, oh my gosh, the agency is operating so unethically. They're doing X, Y, and Z, and it's so unethical, and they're really mistreating people. But when you dig into it a little bit, you can see that like there are many ways to conduct this practice, and maybe this intervention technique doesn't work for you, but it's what the agency has chosen as their dominant mode. And that's not necessarily an ethical issue, right? And so kind of diving into this, untangling it can be, I think, challenging as we are first exposed to dealing with ethical versus non-ethical practice. So kind of touching on this a little bit more deeply, what are the causes of ethical dilemmas? When we have competing values. For example, I believe in equality, but I also believe in justice, right? And so I may take an equity-oriented approach versus an equal approach, right? And those things can be in opposition to one another. Or I gave the example of autonomy, but here's another example, confidentiality versus protecting life. I will break the value of confidentiality if I think it will protect somebody's life because I hold protection of life higher, but those are competing values. Another place where ethical dilemmas occur is in competing loyalties. Am I making a decision based on my loyalty to the agency, who's treated me really well, who signs my paycheck, who is the space where all my professional colleagues and friends work, right? I may have a loyalty to an agency, especially the longer that I work there. But I also need to be loyal to my clients, right? And sometimes those things are in opposition. I can make a decision that is going to maintain that loyalty to the agency or be more closely aligned with the client, and those can be in opposition, right? So just kind of trying to point out that we may have certain values and certain loyalties that are important to us, and those will come into conflict with themselves, with other values and loyalties that are important to us. And so when those competing values and competing loyalties, when we're faced with those, we have to know how to kind of prioritize the values and loyalties that make the most sense, right? So a lot of this work that you see, let me see, do I have this man's name? Frederick Reamer is the person who gets cited all the time in Masters of Social Work programs. And he's the one who came up with this ethical principles screen. And so what you're going to see here is a hierarchy of principles. And if two of these principles are in conflict, you look at the one at the topmost as like a general guiding idea for which one you should prioritize. So, of utmost priority, the principle of the protection of life. In other words, biological life must always take precedence over any other principles. In fact, it is within the context of life that ethical decisions are made. We can't keep making ethical decisions or facing ethical dilemmas if a person is not alive to kind of face them in partnership with, right? So protecting life is like the utmost. The next ethical principle, according to Reamer, is equality and inequality, this principle. So similar circumstances and situations should be treated the same. If you have two clients who are in a similar circumstance or a similar situation, we should treat those folks the same. However, if there are significant differences, that has to be taken into consideration, right? And so unequal treatment may be justified if it would lead to greater equality, right? So equality is pretty high on the post. And so sometimes we'll offer better care or different care, I should say, to a person in order to arrive at a place of equality. The next priority on this ethical principle screen is autonomy and freedom. And so this is the idea that clients' autonomy and their self-determination should always be considered, unless their autonomous actions and the choices that they make would threaten the life of themselves or somebody else, right? So if one of those things is going to happen, then maybe they can lose their autonomy, or it might be justified in curtailing their choices. Yeah. The next one, least harm. I know we're very familiar with this, especially in like a medical doctor context, but the principle of least harm is that we should avoid causing harm and preventing harm from occurring to clients and other people in our sphere of influence. And if harm is unavoidable, we should choose the course of least harm or the most easily reversible harm. And so sometimes we're faced with two choices that both will cause harm. And we have to choose the one that's going to cause the least amount of harm. Do no harm is another way of, you'll sometimes hear this from medical ethics. The next priority would be quality of life. And so this is the principle that enhancing quality of life for clients and other people in our society should be a goal of our social work interventions. And so I don't know. This one I have a hard time with because quality of life is so subjective. So it's really hard to judge whether we're impacting somebody's quality of life. I can make that judgment, but I'm going to be operating from a place of countertransference always based on what I think quality life looks like. And that simply may not be true. One example that I see in the like home visit and homelessness permanent supportive housing space is doing a home visit and looking at the state of an apartment and a case manager saying like, ugh, this apartment is awful, it's terrible, it's unlivable. But that may be an aesthetic determination versus a functional one, right? And so a home that somebody lives in should be functional, but may not always be beautiful because we're going to have different subjectivities around what beautiful is, right? And so I think the quality of life one is tangly and thorny. The next principle that we have is privacy and confidentiality. And we're going to get into a whole section on confidentiality, but the right to privacy for our clients and others should be enhanced wherever possible. And of course, in accordance with the laws that exist. But it may be necessary to break confidentiality when there's like serious harm or death as a potential outcome for clients. So that's where you see this example of protection of life superseding confidentiality and all the rest. Principle 7, this is the last principle on this ethical principles screen, and it is that of truthfulness and full disclosure. So we should be honest and provide full, truthful information to clients and others in order to support a relationship grounded in trust and honesty. I think too frequently in my career, I've seen people hiding the truth, changing the truth because they think it's best for a client. And that I think would not align with best practice in terms of ethics. Let me pause. I've been talking for a while. Any questions or comments that are coming up as we've gone through this ethical principles screen? All right. Just reminding folks, you can feel free to chat, ask questions, do it as we go. Here we go. A couple of other hierarchies. Ooh, I got a question from Greer. Greer said that I was previously values neutral about buying drugs, but are wondering whether I endorse this hierarchy of values. I don't know if I understand the kind of connection there, and I'm not 100% sure that I was values neutral about buying drugs.
Yeah, I think it was like I think we were like challenging the idea of like countertransference and beliefs about substance use. And Greer, you can feel free to add or correct or clarify, but I see things like protection of life and wonder if that's what you're associating with like substance use and
I
prioritizing.
just gave Greer permission to talk, so go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, I wasn't intending it in any kind of snarky sense. It's just much of this presentation in the piece about transference and countertransference has been very careful to treat everyone's values as sort of like independent or not something that you would question, but it does seem like to function, especially for an agency to have a culture, we do need to get on board with some shared sense of values. So maybe you were positing this one, but then what if we do sign on to something like this, but then are we supposed to still go back to that transference countertransference question and not actually hold those values when it comes to the types of like recommendations or courses of treatment that we would bring to clients. Like maybe a wild example would be in a lot of countries now, they've really embraced like a process of choosing to die if quality of life goes downhill. And so, countries that have embraced that clearly aren't signing on to this prioritization of values.
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that I don't know that I always 100% personally endorse this ethical principle screen. But I think you're right that like in that example, you would be putting autonomy higher than protection of life. Or not you, these countries would be uplifting that priority. What do I want to say here? You made a statement that I think I agree with, which is that in the context of an organization, there does have to be some continuity or like agreement. And we are going to be faced with things that are in conflict with one another, right? Like that is the inherent thing that's happening in an ethical dilemma. These ones that you see on the screen, I think are going to most closely align with codes of ethics for most of the professions represented here in this meeting. Medical doctors, social workers, nurses, CPSs. So I think what you see on the screen is a reflection, kind of reflecting back to you what people have already said about ethics. Do I think that these are like the end all be all? No, I don't think so. I think I said already that I hold autonomy at like much higher than many of the people that I talk to, I'm in relationship with. What else do I want to say? I don't know if I have much else to say. I think I'm just like rambling. Greer, do you have anything else to say or clarifying comments or maybe rather than asking what we think, what do you think about an ethical principle screen here?
Well, I'm very intrigued by this sort of hierarchy. I don't think I've seen a hierarchy spelled out that way before. So that's certainly intriguing to me. I think kind of the rub that I'm experiencing in having part one and part two of this training together, it's interesting to see that sort of transference discussion or countertransference discussion. A lot of emphasis is putting on sort of checking your own values at the door. And yet we do need to share some values as an agency and just to be effective social workers or ethical social workers. So that's kind of the tension that I'm experiencing.
Yeah, here's another, yes, thanks for saying even more there. I think, so to use my own example, if I place autonomy above all else personally, and then I make my ethical decisions based on that, I will sometimes run afoul of like the literal law, right? In that protection of life example. And so I think it is okay to like maybe have your own very personal understanding of these ethical principles, but also you're going to have to recognize that like we do operate in these larger contexts and our own personal values, yeah, are going to be in opposition to what our organization wants us to do, right? And so there's another like ethical decision right there for us, which is, am I going to use my personal value set or like this professional one that I'm supposed to agree to? And I think people get in trouble with that all the time and feel really good about that. Like, I'm going to make this personal decision because I think it is the right thing to do, and I'm going to lose my job as a result of it. And that can be okay, or that can be, I mean, I think that happens all the time. I guess I'm not suggesting that this should be the ethical principle screen that you use, but it is one that reflects back to you what's going to be most typical in like an organizational context.
Mhm.
Sure, sure. And just recognizing that this is a very Western or American based conception of this hierarchy. You know, a different culture might have a very different hierarchy.
100% agreed.
Yeah, if I could add anything, I think one of the things that I think about is, sure, there will be some challenge or tension between like our own like guiding ethics and principles, values versus our agency sometimes. Sometimes they are really aligned, right? But also, I think when it comes to these specific ethical principles on the screen, these are going to look different and maybe be prioritized in different ways based on like setting. So like if I work for a harm reduction organization, um, I know that my work there when it comes to substance use and things like that is going to look very different than if I am working at an inpatient rehab, right? How we think about substance use collectively as the agency, right? Which is, I think, is what I hear like we're talking about here. What do we believe as an agency, right? In an inpatient rehab, if you're bringing substances in, that's probably like a, well, what are you here for, right? At a harm reduction organization where that is the work, and we are maybe providing some tools to make use safer, there's going to be different principles influencing that decision. And because of that agency collective culture, like big idea culture, harm reduction, other big idea culture being like recovery and substance use, probably abstinence, right? Those guiding like some of these um, principles. And our own values and morals might not be super aligned or could be with either of those settings. I think in the context of this training, listing them like this is supposed to be like, if you do have an ethical dilemma, here is a possible way we might make a decision given some written words and what somebody said feels best or healthy, right? Based on this specific ranking system. If you have an ethical dilemma and somebody's going to be hurt, right? Versus, I see, truthfulness and full disclosure here. Maybe I'm putting this above the other if these are like the camps that they exist in. I think sometimes these trainings feel fluffy, and this is like an aim at here's one possible solution to moving through ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, I'll just say one more thing to kind of co-sign something you said, Greer, which is that yes, and this is like a culturally situated way of looking at this. The end. And certainly there are other ways to do that. Here was further kind of examples around applying those hierarchies. This comes from a specific text. So protecting survival would overrule protecting truthfulness or quality of life. Another example is a person's right to well-being would overrule another person's right to self-determination. So that's to say that like I have the autonomy to choose my actions, but if that start harming other people, that's when it's crossed the line. I think we see examples, we see challenges with this with ethical decision making, especially in like co-living spaces where harm reduction is used. We have some shared apartments now at Pathways where people came from rehab right before being housed and somebody picks up again. And so we've got a person who is trying to maintain sobriety and a person who's not, and trying to figure out the line of where that self-determination has like overlapped and overruled somebody else's right to well-being. On the flip side of that, a person's right to self-determination overrules their own right to well-being. And I think this, to me, represents kind of the fundamentals around harm reduction. I get to hurt myself, or I get to impact my own quality of life because it is my own life. Voluntary consent to laws and rules would overrule the right to act in disagreement with them. This one is tricky because I think for things like program rules, it doesn't always feel like a choice that people are voluntarily consenting to. We say it is. We say, if you want to join this program, you have to consent to these rules. And so people do, but that doesn't always feel very voluntary to me. I think it feels pressured based on this like housing resources that we're holding for people, over people. And then the possibility that the right to well-being might overrule laws and rules, etc. Oh, I'm going to skip that one. In the interest of time, I'm not going to kind of walk through this case, but we have just kind of like a very generic case exploring the possibility of dealing with ethical decision-making with competing values. Rather than walk through it with a case, I'll just walk you through this ethical decision-making model. Again, this comes from Reamer again. And it's been said that this is just a fancy way of saying, how can we problem solve in a way that makes the most sense for the most people? So this is the stages. These are the stages of ethical decision-making that we can kind of confront. We can identify the ethical issue. We can identify who's being impacted and seek help. We can think critically about how this is going to impact people and examine the pros and cons. We'll make our decision and document that decision, and then we'll evaluate and follow up. We walk you through each of these. And in the case that you see earlier, you can read it later if you care to. The kind of values that were competing in this case were a client's right to self-determination and protecting this person from harm. Once we've identified that conflict, we want to identify who's going to be impacted and seek help. And so Louisa was impacted, Louisa's family was impacted, and the organization was impacted in that case. And then trying to determine who's the appropriate help. Supervisor is always a good person. A coworker or a colleague is always good. Some organizations have ethics committees that they hold, that they retain in order to kind of provide additional support. I've never worked for an organization that has that, but I recognize that it is possible. Liability insurance might have something to say about our course of actions. Our licensing and certification board might have something to say about it and can sometimes be a resource, right? So if you're a licensed worker, for example, Khalil and I are licensed in the state of Pennsylvania, we can go to the National Alliance for Social Workers, and we can also go to PA's version of the Social Work Alliance and ask for support in ethical decision-making that way. And then sometimes we may even rely on friends and family members. Once we've identified the ethical issues at stake, we have thought about who's going to be impacted, we want to think about more of the context. So we're reflecting on all the relevant factors here. We are considering multiple perspectives, right? What's the perspective that the client will have if I make this decision? What's the perspective of my supervisor? What if we lived in a different state? Does that even matter? Kind of trying to weigh all of this and look at this from different angles is part of it, and identifying and weighing our obligations. The agency has this policy. The laws say this, but this outcome would be the best outcome, right? And that's in conflict, right? So trying to kind of weigh all of that and then start to brainstorm some options and figure out what the consequences of those options would be. I see your question, David, of when and where these slides and presentations will be made available. By the end of the week, you'll have these in your email inbox from me. I'll send you an email with a copy of the slides and a link to the evaluation.
The recording will also be up on the coalition's website probably by Monday.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. We'll examine the pros and cons. I think this is a really important step that we take. We may have several options in front of us, and we may have some options in front of us that are obviously bad, and we don't want to take them. But I think it's important that we line up all of our options for what courses of action we might take against one another and weigh them. Examine the pros and cons of each of them. We'll explore the code of ethics, whether that has anything to say, any legal principles. And we'll also explore our personal values and sometimes hold those against our agency policies and our agency values. Finally, when we've done all that, we'll be able to make our decision. I don't know that I've ever felt great about ethical decision-making, but you arrive at a point where this is the best course of action, and we'll document that Next up, we will evaluate what we did, see how those courses of action played out, see what consequences came up, decide whether we thought actually this turned out in the best way possible, and whether we think this was successful or unsuccessful. Did you have something to add on this slide, Carlo? Okay. So I went through that really fast, mostly in the interest of time. I think you could have, I'm really like sitting with those comments earlier from Greer, and just acknowledging that like that ethical principles screen is not the answer. It is one way to examine these things. And if we're doing that, I think we do have to use kind of a stage-wise process for further picking apart the nuance of an ethical dilemma. And so that that 6-stage model is offered as a tool to do that. All right, I'm ready to kick it over to you, Khalil, to talk about confidentiality.
Awesome. This is also something that I think we kind of lump into like the boundary space, right? It might sound like that's confidential, right? In the simplest context. But what you can see on the screen here, these are some guiding questions for like understanding confidentiality and to be like mostly conversational and discussion based. But I think this slide also makes a good kind of like agenda or like task item. Our slides are also labeled quite similarly to the questions that you see on this confidentiality slide right here. A definition that we'll use is confidentiality is the idea that information is entrusted by one person to another, and there is an express understanding that this will not be divulged, right? A lot of times clients will ask you about the limits to confidentiality, right? Especially depending on what setting, right? If there are kiddos involved, if there are substances involved, if treatment is mandated, this is often something that folks are soliciting from you, the provider. So these are some of the questions we will work through. Ryan, can you click to the next slide? So the first question is, why is confidentiality important? And if we think back to the boundary slide, I think that idea of confidentiality being important for safety is one of the things that could be slapped on this slide as well. That is not, well, it is here in the professional sense, right? Honoring a client's confidentiality keeps me and my license safe. And even if you're not in a role or hold a role that needs licensure or has a license, your agency likely holds many licenses to provide the care that they do, right? So that is also something at risk if we are not carefully adhering to some rules and regulations around confidentiality. So the NASW is a National Association of Social Work. They have a code of ethics, and according to their code of ethics, practitioners are obligated to respect a participant's right to privacy in general, right? I don't want to share information unless I absolutely have to, is going to be like the guiding principle there. Confidentiality protects both the participant's rights and autonomy. So yes, a client has just a right to privacy, right? And to keep this vulnerable information in a space if that is appropriate. But also I'm sorry, I said autonomy because we talk about that a lot, but their right to remain anonymous is what I actually meant to say there. There might be safety implications depending on the setting in them sharing information. I also think about when agencies ask for feedback or measuring outcomes or client satisfaction is another place where like remaining anonymous is pretty important to folks, whether that is employee feedback, participant or population feedback is another space that I don't think we talk about confidentiality enough in, but is another space that this concept exists. So it protects us as a person practicing in a behavioral health and medical field, and especially those who hold dual relationships with clients who live in small communities. So we talked about the idea of dual relationships in the boundaries portion of the content, but that also applies here, right? So in that example of the dog park, right? Am I going to immediately say, oh, this is my client from this agency? no, right? I'm going to protect that and keep my work with that participant confidential. Say hello to them. Alrighty, so the next slide is about protected information. So HIPAA, something that we all know, I think, or know of, or at least have heard. I actually think it's quite funny. So HIPAA stands for the Health Information. Wow, I actually can't see it here. It's on the screen, but I like to talk about the acronym a lot because most people spell it HIPPA, like a hippo, but with an A at the end, but it's actually HIPAA. But it names 18 distinct informational elements that are considered to be identifiers, also known as private health information. So PHI is another like buzz term or buzzword that we use often in our workspaces. But this is going to include very basic like identifying information, right? Someone's name, address, social security number, their photograph. And again, HIPAA has 18 distinct informational elements that says we probably shouldn't be sharing this, or you cannot share this unless there are specific special considerations. So there are special considerations for folks with substance use disorders, different mental health conditions, people with an HIV and AIDS diagnosis, and also in intimate partner violence situations, and also human trafficking scenarios, all situations where confidentiality is still important, but going to be navigated a little bit differently. So we'll talk about some of those special considerations a little more in depth. When it comes to substance use disorders or mental health considerations, if a patient has overdosed or is incapacitated and unable to agree or object to specific care or life-changing, life-saving treatment, a doctor might notify a family member, reach out to next of kin or representative for that person to be responsible for making decisions for that person who's unable due to their current physical state and mental state and ability to consent to treatment. So what that looks like is somebody overdoses, is unresponsive, right? We might immediately try to identify somebody who can be making some health decisions for this person. That is an example of kind of stepping out of the box of confidentiality, right? Because we need some information. A medical provider might need to provide care and might need consent or permission to do so. There's also VAWA is the Violence Against Women Act, passed in 1994. This is specifically related to the intimate partner violence space or domestic violence. Any information submitted to a public housing agency or owner or manager under just that exists in that space, including information related to them being in a domestic violence situation, should be held in confidence, right? Should be kept private by that housing agency or institution to protect that person's right to privacy. It can't be entered into any database or disclosed to any other entity or individual, right? And then when it comes to human trafficking, PHI or public or private health information can only be disclosed if somebody is a minor, if there's child abuse, or if there are mandatory reporting measures or imminent danger involved. And imminent danger will likely be with patient permission. Oh, and I almost forgot about HIV related information. So there's an Act 148.
That's
Yeah.
a Pennsylvania specific act,
I was
actually.
just going to say, yeah. So this exists here in Pennsylvania. It looks like the full title is Pennsylvania's Act 148 prohibits healthcare providers and social service providers from disclosing HIV-related information without the permission of the subject, the participant, except in certain limited instances, which might involve things like imminent danger, child abuse, and those special considerations. This is something I've seen in my own practice, like as a helping professional, is we need to be careful about where we're keeping information about folks' HIV diagnosis, I think there was talk at Pathways on one occasion, or probably many occasions, about creating a team to serve folks, particularly with an HIV diagnosis, and that gets messy for many reasons. I think especially because of this. And also, I remember being in a supervision sort of like task conversation with a supervisor of mine and navigating some insurance stuff for a client that I was seeing. And my supervisor said, like, I don't think this makes sense unless this person has an HIV diagnosis. And then my supervisor asked explicitly, like, does this person have HIV? And I just kind of paused. Therapists love silence, or should anyway, working on it, right? And then my supervisor said, you know what? Yeah, never mind. This doesn't make, can't do this, right? We were both kind of like, what do we do in this situation? So those are some of the special considerations when it comes to PHI, and when we might be disclosing or stepping out of what we believe confidentiality to be, because of some of the special considerations and or protections. Workspaces. It's important to also maintain confidentiality in our workspaces. I think this is also a great like trauma-informed care tip, right? Do we have lists of caseloads and who is serving who's on like what team or receiving what services in just visible in our workspaces? And if we do, is that harmful to the confidentiality of some folks, right? Paperwork should never be left out on your desk. Sometimes this is something that we see also, right? There are like papers and just so many documents in our field, right? And they might be like spread out across. If you work in a team model, there may be people consistently coming in and out of specific space, right? Do we have a space where files can be stored? Do we have a table where we keep paperwork, right? And are those items private? So I think I covered this, but bulletin boards shouldn't list names or addresses of anybody, phone numbers, or participant information. And we want to be careful. We want to carefully consider what personal information we are displaying, right? I think about the fun example of like bumper stickers on cars. Does your bumper sticker say what school your children go to currently, right? Is that what we want folks to be knowing about us? Is that a tell? Some of our bumper stickers, or our own pins and personalization things that we keep like on our book bags or fanny packs, whatever, sometimes skew very political. Are these things that we want folks in specific settings to be knowing about us, or not, right? Another example that we have here in the notes is the idea of like having an NA tag on our keys, right? Narcotics Anonymous. If we are part of that community, is this something that we do or don't want folks to know in our work spaces? Is another consideration to be thinking about. And then we also have workplace etiquette. What are we doing with our actions, right? That might kind of step on the toes of confidentiality is going to be important to be thinking about. So we want to be mindful of who or what we're discussing and who else is around. I think this is another example of trauma-informed care coming into play, right? Clients are aware and can observe you talking about other clients and participants, right? So if you're talking really poorly, or not in the best light about participants and your own stress and frustration around a specific participant or case scenario or case situation, what does that signal to a participant, right? How do they view you talking about them when nobody else is in the room, or when there are other people in the room, right? And it doesn't mean there shouldn't be space for this, but being knowledgeable about who is present, who is in the room, is going to be important. Not discussing personal details of housing, meds, mental health, behavioral health stuff while clients are there is going to be important, even if you're omitting names. This is something, our care for folks is oftentimes very individualized because folks are very different, right? Have different needs. And this is something that also kind of blurs the lines and makes things a little messy sometimes in our work settings when folks are like, oh, well, we did this for this one person. Why can't you do it for me? Right? Is something that comes up when we're not careful about this specific item as well. How we're acting, how we're talking in the workplace. The next topic is phone usage. This one is pretty self-explanatory, right? If you are in a role where you have a work cell or in your office where you're often talking on like a work phone, The idea of excusing yourself if you're around anyone who's not on your team might be important. Staying aware of what you say in public places, right? On public transit. Are you talking on speakerphone on public transit? That's one of my pet peeves on public transit is other people doing that. Not even helping professionals, right? Just like personal conversations was like, oh my word, why are we doing that? But also, this point about people being nosy, I think, is one of the most important pieces here, right? I'm pretty nosy. If you're talking on speakerphone out loud about some hot gossip that I'm not part of, I could be part of it, right? If you're on speaker and quite loud. So we especially don't want to be doing that when it comes to our work lives and our work circumstances and situations that are very personal and vulnerable to the folks that we are serving. So we want to use speakerphone sparingly and when it's appropriate. And we don't want to use any of those PHI items, right? We don't want to be using somebody's name, full name, information, text. You might have a way that this is standardized in your agency already, right? At Pathways, we use first two letters of the first name, first two letters of the last name, right? At other agencies, they might use just initials, right? First, last, and talk about participants in digital communication that way. Yeah, Ryan gave an example of what that would look like for their name. If they were a Pathways resident, right? RYVI would be Ryan. We want to stick to the essentials also in like text communication, I think especially. Some things are better said or communicated over the phone. And I think about this in like a staff to staff way, but also in staff to like participant way. If you're on a role where you're communicating with participants over the phone, some things are better said or better interpreted when we can use our voice, right? Rather than written language. And there are also some limits to confidentiality, which I think we've talked about a lot already. Ryan, if you could click to the next slide. And these limits of confidentiality are going to be child or elder abuse, right? So if we work with older adults and we suspect abuse in these situations, or children and we suspect abuse, we have to break confidentiality in many circumstances, right? To report that suspected abuse. Also, when we have a duty to warn, right? When somebody is in imminent danger and we know or we have information that they're going to hurt themselves or really harm somebody else in a way that feels serious and very real, some of us might have a duty to warn or to give as much information about the other party as possible, right? For therapists, we have a duty to warn when a patient communicates serious threat of physical violence against somebody or somebody's, right? Mass violence or like individual violence. And this is where we might be giving a little more information about our clients or participants than we might normally. There are also court orders, right? We're kind of put in a box and not able to not give information based on the guidelines of specific court orders. There are insurance limitations, right? Where you have to communicate specific diagnoses and pretty much a ton of information about a client sometimes to so that person is receiving their insurance benefits and able to continue engaging in care. We have the Patriot Act of 2001 here in a nutshell. This
It's basically that like the FBI can investigate your client and see whatever records that they want, and we are like under a gag order that we can't tell the client that that's happening.
Right. So the idea of, I think best practice when it comes to confidentiality is to let folks know, again, on the front end, like, hey, here's when I do have to kind of step out of the therapy space or this case management office and let somebody know something, right? And I might talk about child abuse or duty to warn, right? And I also think like best practices to follow up when we do have to do that. Hey, just let you know, because this thing happened, here's what I had to do, how to make this child line report, right? How to like report suspected child abuse. What the Patriot Act of 2001 does is it says we can ask you for information, and also you're not allowed to tell your clients, right? Which really does a lot, or has the potential to do a lot to the therapeutic alliance or therapeutic relationship being built there. And then the idea of Ryan talked about the idea of doing the least harm. Sometimes you have to make decisions that don't necessarily feel great, and there might be some harm involved, but is the last tool in our tool belt. I think about the idea of involuntary hospitalization being an example of this, when we might have to share some information about a client, or giving as much information as possible so that there is potentially less harm involved. I think about this also in involving the police with folks, whether there are like racial concerns or like psychiatric concerns in somebody's relationship to the police. Are we giving the police or whoever is responding additional information to protect our client or the person at that time? And then the idea of giving information on a need to know basis, I think is an important consideration when it comes to confidentiality, right? I'm sharing based on who needs to know and why, right? Even within a team, if we're on the same team, right, there might be some information that not everybody needs to know. Especially when it comes to that person receiving care. When I was working on the polysubstance use team at Pathways, we were working with somebody who had a pretty significant health issue, and so this participant we were working with had actually like a prolapsed uterus. And that was information that she was very sensitive about sharing with other people, and rightfully so. This is a pretty intense medical issue, right? So the way we navigated this is there were 1 or 2 case managers on the team, or service coordinators, who were in the loop about this person's medical concerns. The only thing that the rest of the team needed to know was that this person was having a medical concern and needed some support with their medical appointments and treatment. They didn't need to know the ins and outs, right? If our client wanted to share that with them, they were absolutely able to do that. But I think that's an example of maybe sharing some things on a need to know basis, even within a team, right? Especially if care is going to be given in the same way. The service coordinator wasn't necessarily their medical provider, but could still be super supportive in getting them to their medical treatments. I think an important kind of guiding question is, or just thing to be thinking about, is not knowing where information goes after we share it, right? So we can't protect where things go after we like disclose something or share something about a client. So thinking before we share is going to be really important. I think about if we work with clients who touch many different systems or service agencies, which I think comes up a lot in homelessness. There's sometimes this culture of like, oh, I can reach out to this other person provider and just ask about their treatment, ask if they're okay, ask if they're receiving services, right? But we don't know, we might not always know our participant's situation or relationship with this other agency, right? So asking our participant first, or moving through all the parts of going through a release of information to be communicating with that agency, is also how we might protect confidentiality in these situations. And then we have the idea of just reaching out to a supervisor to ask for support when we might need it, right? Being able to follow up and receive support if we don't know if we're going to potentially breach confidentiality. We can always be reaching out to other resources or our superiors for some guidance there.
All right, folks, we have reached the end of our prepared content. We rarely have Q&A time at the end of these sessions, and we are blessed with like 6 minutes of time if we want to use it. So welcoming questions and comments at this time. Feel free to put things in the chat or raise your hand. I think Laura may be able to help us unmute. But that said, I'll put the link to our course evaluation into the chat. Remember, if you need or want continuing education credit for social workers, you have to complete this course evaluation. And if you want a certificate of any kind, you also have to fill out this course evaluation. So here is the link. Make sure you click on that, and you can also look for that in your inbox a little later. And just as a pre-word, if there are no questions or comments, I will say thank you so much for allowing us to speak with you all again. It's been 3 sessions that we've had a chance to talk with you, and we've reached the end of our engagement, but it's been super pleasurable for us and super fun. So thanks for being here, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, see you all. Take care.
Right. Just remember that there are 2 evaluations, one for Housing First University and one for the coalition. And you can check our website in a few days for a recording of this presentation. And our next community table session is Know Your Rights under House Bill 5, presented by the ACLU of Kentucky. You can go to our website and register for that. All right. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Take care.